You know, I always was doing things related to art. That's what I wanted to do out of my life, was create beautiful things, decorative things.
Maja is originally from Quito, Ecuador. He described it as a very conservative place, a very Catholic place, and for a young gay boy and growing up there, he felt perpetually chased after, as well as the whole set of like physical and emotional abuse that he had to undergo.
My parents told me, you got to move, because they noticed that I was different. And in Ecuador, in those days, there were no room for me. And I started to be attacked by people because the way I dressed. I had long hair and I wore bell-bottom pants. They tried to change me. They tried to cut my hair, but I didn't want to. And then they said, you have to leave the country. You cannot live here, because they were ashamed of me. I wanted to leave too, you know. I wanted to see Los Angeles. So I arrived here, 1972. First job I got was through my sister-in-law, Maja. She was working on the offices of Santa Marta Hospital, and I started washing dishes. Then I met this very skinny sister that we used to call her Sister Spaghetti, Sister Catherine.
And she told Milton about this woman, Sister Karen.
That she was starting a program to help Latin American artists in Los Angeles.
He goes to Sister Karen's house. And so he arrives there, and there he meets Carlos Bueno y Antonio Ibanez. And Carlos and Antonio had also recently arrived to Los Angeles from Mexico City. And he meets them there, and he finds, you know, creative hippie types who are interested in making art, in learning about art, in interacting with community. The institution as a whole was not interested in supporting Chicano artists, and so part of the impetus, right, was to create the infrastructure for themselves.
I was part of the crew that helped move things, clean up things, because it was in a really bad condition. Right after everything was ready, Carlos Bueno's idea to make Dia de los Muertos.
Self-help is the birthplace of Dia de los Muertos on this side of the border. So the Chicano version of it that's celebrated in Los Angeles, that starts at Self-help. And Milton is part of that initial crew.
Well, we didn't have any permits to go out in the streets or anything, so Sister Karen found this space behind a liquor store, so that's where we went.
I don't know how many people would just sort of just say, yeah, of course, I absolutely want to do that. You know? And now you can go to Day of the Dead at the Hollywood Cemetery, and it's like the most glamorous thing that's sponsored by Absolute Vodka and all that stuff. But it started off with folks like Milton, dressing as La Catrina, essentially in drag, right? Because he was dressed as a woman skeleton.
That was the first celebration of Dia de los Muertos that was a success. At the first time, people loved it. After that, it became everybody's favorite. It was already mine from Ecuador. Dia de los Muertos to me was the most beautiful holiday because I got to do arts and crafts. When I was in Ecuador, we celebrated Dia de los Muertos making pan, bread art.
From the beginning, Milton was making those bread dough sculptures, and bread dough sculpture resonated, I imagine, very much with Sister Karen, because Sister Karen was trained at Immaculate Heart College. They loved to make bread dough sculpture. So that tradition is an interesting one at Self-Help because it comes, one, partially through Sister Karen, and then also partially through Ecuador, through Milton.
Self-Help Graphics was wonderful because it was a lot of artists There was no community for artists that time. None whatsoever. Self-help graphics was the only place for Latinos.
Milton's story is particular to the ongoing work we have to do around diversifying the range of voices and perspectives that we think of and that we hear when we're talking about Latino art or Latinx art in general, right? Because it's not just Mexico. There's all of Central America, Caribbean as well, and all of South America. And we seldomly hear from those artists from those places. Milton's not Mexican. He's not Chicano. And he arrives in a situation where he then has to negotiate these very, very strong cultural currents.
Chicano artist, I love it. I love the art, but I was not Chicano. So I felt really weird when I was around because I felt minimized around this art.
He said to me once that, when I got to LA, I really felt like I had to become Mexican because those were the currents, and I had to work in a market, and I had to, make work that people were going to want, and so I had to somewhat compromise.
So what he knew was totally different from what everybody else knew. He knew about the jungle, he knew about the Indians, he knew about the way of life. They didn't have that here.
Through my life, it was very hard for me because I wanted to be an artist. I'm not the type of person that can do a job 9 to 5. And I was married, kids. I had to do some of the stuff, and I had to do anything for money, and it was very difficult for me.
In a world where you are not visible, not present, and constantly having to negotiate what you allow yourself to tell people and what you have to keep hidden, that art repeatedly offered him a space to feel centered and to feel whole.
There was a lot of local artists showing in the galleries, and here, the galleries, of course, there was white. There was no Latino art in none of the galleries that I ever visit. I started making my own furniture to sell because the first furniture I made it for my house. And I started taking it to the shops around Los Angeles and showing them what I do. And they thought, oh, it looks very nice, but it looks too artistic, so maybe you should sell it in an art gallery. And I went to the art galleries and they said, oh, it looks too functional, maybe you should sell it in a furniture store. And I was going back and forth. And everybody was telling me the same thing, so finally I opened my factory in designing all kinds of furniture, making from wrought iron to upholstered furniture to bamboo furniture and hand-painted furniture. And I became a really successful manufacturer. I opened the first functional art store in Echo Park.
When I saw Maja's work, the first time it's like, oh my God, this is Echo Park folk art. And Maja doesn't just make furniture or paint wonderful paintings. He can make a side table, he can make armoires, he can make secretaries, desks, he can make a bed, he can make railings. He's our go-to guy when we want to have something made.
Milton was continuing to master his craft, making furniture. And he would paint that furniture. And he would paint it with, flowers that he had seen on in Mexican paintings, as well as vegetation from Quito that he remembered from the jungle, and that he would put on there. And so he became an excellent painter at rendering flowers and rendering vegetation and rendering things that we typically relegate to kind of decorative elements. But those decorative elements were always important because Carlos Bueno, Antonio Ibanez, in their murals and in their printmaking, they had flowers. They were very invested in the fact that these things were beautiful and that they should be represented and that they were part of a Mexican tradition.
In the 80s and 90s, when I was selling Latin American art, it was very popular and I was selling a lot. So in order to survive, I have to become better.
The idea that he has maintained this undocumented perspective that he keeps in his work, I think you see that in the work. They are very kind of hyper-realist, but also fantastical images of LA. he described it to me as wanting to insist on always having this feeling of like arriving from a small city and coming into a big city.
I am Latin American and I like the way I'm doing because it's not exactly coming from the Chicano movement, but it's coming from learning and living in Los Angeles. I think of myself as a cultural artist because I'm starting to project culture in all my art.
What I see with Maja, I don't see that he's really tried to change. If you see a piece of his work today versus one from 30, you recognize, yeah, there's differences, but you recognize it as his work.
Latino art in general is right now in a moment, like I say, of decolonizing, trying to figure out how to have more equitable language, how to be more inclusive, and how to also recognize that those things which have been categorized as not modern are very valuable, right? Because also what happens when you go to Mexico, you go to Central America, everything that's modern is good, right? That's the line. Modern materials like concrete and steel and stuff, those are, like in Peru, for example, they're called materia noble, noble material, right? But the adobe, the clay work that's indigenous to those places, that's not called noble materials. Those are the not noble materials because they're not modern. And so those artists who are working in traditions that have not been considered, that have not been allowed inside of the discourse of modern art, which were not part of those traditions, those have been then excluded. And so then those artists working in those traditions, those are valuable practices for returning, for preserving, for readapting. And I think that Milton has remained very committed to that.
I don't think real artists do it for the fame or the money, although it doesn't hurt if that comes. But you do it because you can't not do it.
For me, it was very important to be around, art, because that was the basics of, to be who I am now. I learned it there. I learned to appreciate my indigenous people, my Latin American culture, and that's who I am now. I am a Latin American artist. 50 years of living in the United States, and I feel more Latino than than ever.